Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, as the case may be. My name is Claire Bradley, and I am the Director of Irish Studies here at the school. This is our monthly meeting for Irish Studies, and today's topic is Griffith's valuation. I am going to share my screen now, and I'll run you through some slides, and then we're going to do a couple of live demos, and then there'll be some time for questions at the end. Okay, hopefully everyone can see the screen. Maybe just give me a verbal yes, if that's okay.
Yes, I can see it.
Thanks, Julie.
Yes.
Thanks very much, everyone. Okay, so the main census substitute for Ireland is called the primary valuation of Ireland, and it's known colloquially as Griffith's valuation. The reason it's called that is because a man called Sir Richard Griffith was in charge of organising it. He was a geologist. He was employed by the British government to arrange and carry out a valuation of all land in Ireland for tax purposes. It was the first project of its type, and it took many, many years to complete. The reason we use it as a census substitute, of course, is that we have lost most of our 19th century censuses in Ireland through a series of what I like to call unfortunate events. We have a fire in the Public Records Office in 1922, which destroyed the early censuses from 1821 to 1851. The censuses of 1861 and 71 were destroyed shortly after the statistical work was completed. And the censuses of 1881 and 91 were pulped during World War I for paper in a mistaken expectation that there were, hang on 1 second, that there were a second copy of them available, which there was not. They had done 2 copies of every census return in the rest of the UK by having a household return and then a enumerator's copy. And whoever gave this order in Ireland thought that there was an enumerator copy as well, which there was not. They did it on the cheap in Ireland. So they inadvertently, not maliciously, destroyed the only copies. So if we had those 19th century censuses, we would never look at Griffith's valuation or the Tithe Allotment books, which we looked at in our last virtual meeting. But we do have to look at this, and it does make us more creative as genealogists go. So this valuation, the preparatory work for it began in the 1820s, and it continued up until 1856. And then the published valuation started from 1847 and ran to 1864. So you can see that it covers quite a large period of time. And there's a difference between what's in the preparatory work and the published work. And that's because they only had a certain number of men, and of course they were all men, going around valuing the land, talking to the people who lived on it, and so on. And then as they completed each area, they'd move on to the next area. And so the publication dates for Griffith's valuation cover 1847 to 1864. So you see different dates on individual locations, and that date is important because if you find someone you think is your ancestor on Griffith's valuation and they're there in 1848, well then you've got a date much earlier than the civil records cover, and maybe you can tie that into some parish records or something else. Richard Griffith was meticulous in his organisation, and he personally oversaw all appeals. So it wasn't just a here's the valuation, like it or lump it situation. It was you could appeal and go, no, that's not right. This land isn't as good quality as you've said it is, and so on. Now, that didn't mean that they took your word for it, of course, but there was an appeals process. The records were originally stored at his house, which was a purpose-built house on Ely Place in Dublin. It actually still stands today. And it was stored there for over 100 years. And the good news is that those archives were not transferred to the National Archives until a long time after the fire in 1922. So these records survive in great detail, and we generally consider that they are, I hesitate to use the word complete, but they are comprehensive, let's say. So let's take a look then at what we've got in it. So the valuation was paid on the the tax was paid to the state on the value of land. Sorry, I've got a typo on my slide there. So it was all land, whereas we saw last time with the tithe allotment books that it only covered agricultural land and was therefore very unfair. If you lived in a house in a city, it wasn't payable. If you had a nice garden with landscaped trees in it, that wasn't payable, but it was payable on an acre of potatoes. So this Griffith's valuation then covers a later period than the tithe allotments, which was in the 1820s and 1830s. So sometimes we can find someone, if they lived long enough to be in the tithe allotment books, Griffith's valuation, and then maybe they've died at the beginning of civil registration. Or often what we can do is we can find someone in Griffith's valuation or who is the father of someone that we found in later records. Unlike the tithe allotment books, these records were measured in standard acres. So there was a difference between Irish acres and standard acres. Irish acres were bigger. So these records were put into something that was comparable to the rest of the United Kingdom at the time. And so the measurement is in acres, roods, and perches. We also have the preparatory work available for Griffiths, and it's on a different website to the main website that we use for Griffiths. So we'll be looking at both of those. And I do have a slide later on in the presentation showing you all the places that you can look at Griffiths valuation. Now, who's not in these records? So we're only going to get head of household, and we'll look at an example in a minute. But so people who do not have land that they are occupying themselves, renting in some way, don't appear in these records. So the class of men who are landless labourers, who are going around working for someone else, or cottiers we sometimes call them, they're not going to appear in these records. And we're also not going to get tenement dwellers. We're not going to get the people who live in big buildings with many, many families in them. They don't appear in them either. And we don't get lists of families. So this is why we would say it's a census substitute. We're just getting usually the head of the household or the person who's occupying the land. Now, that does mean that women appear in these records, but the vast majority of the names you're going to see are men. So that's a sort of a short run of how it works. Let's look now at what we get in the records. Okay, so the Griffith's valuation is broken down by county, first of all, and then by barony. And this crosses poor law unions, and then into civil parishes, and then a townland. So mainly you're going to be looking at a townland or a civil parish if you know where you're looking for. So this example that I've given here, the smallest unit is the Yellow Walls townland in a place called Malahide, which is the same name as the civil parish. The poor law union of where Malahide is today even is called Balrotherry, and that is in the barony of Coolock, and that is in the county of Dublin. A tangent to what the area was called Yellow Walls because there was a tannery in the townland, and they used to put their leather out on the walls to dry, and so the yellow dye would run out of the leather and onto the walls. And so there are no actual yellow walls there today, but that's the origin of the name, which I think is interesting. If you don't know where your place is, and I know I say this every time we meet, you need to have a good sense of where you're looking for, because there are townlands that have the same name in different places in Ireland. And so if you don't already know that, you should look at the swilson.info website that we've discussed before, the Townland Index. And I'm going to pop that URL into the chat now. Shane is a friend of mine, and he's got an amazing set of resources up for free on his website. And one of the best ones is the digitized copy of the 1851 Townland Index, which is also produced as a book. And this was a way of codifying the spellings of townlands, which was produced in parallel to the 1851 census. There's also a 1901 Townland Index, but I tend to use the one on Shane's website as being a better interface. So what do we get when we get onto Griffith's valuation? So the first thing we get is the name of the occupier. And you might say, what does occupier mean? Well, just think of it as the person occupying the land. So the renter. And then we get the name of the immediate lessor. So as in they've got a lease. So the person they're renting the land from. Now, that might not be the person who owns the land. It might be a middleman. It might be a large farmer who's rented a large piece of land from someone else, and then he's subletting parts of it to other people. If it's the actual owner of the land, you'll see the words in fee, INFEE. And then you know that that's the person who owns the land. So sometimes you see a whole town land, and at the top of it, it says Charles O'Brien in fee. And then you see everybody else listed underneath him, and they're all, you know, Seamus Murphy, and they're renting from Charles O'Brien, and so on. And so you can usually help, you know, it's always helpful to look at the whole town land in context rather than just isolating one name. So it lists every landholder and householder as well as property owner, who is described as the immediate lessor. You get the size of the holding, which is described in acres, roods, and perches. You get a description of the property and a valuation, which is in pounds, shilling, and pence. Now, the description of the property can be quite variable. The standard format is something like house, office, and land. Now, office doesn't mean that they had a little shed in their back garden where they're running their Instagram business. Offices just means outbuildings. So it would be anything from a toilet to a shed for animals, to a barn, to you know, other farm properties. Other buildings like a forge or a mill, they're all itemized separately, so they will be described. Or if it's a school or a public building or a railway, they all get described separately. But when you see house, offices, and land, it's a kind of a standard format, but it's not a very helpful format, because what does that mean? And Griffith actually defined houses quite diversely. So everything says house, and then you might get, you know, a house that is a many-roomed stone-built mansion or a single-roomed mud-walled cabin. They're both going to be down as a house if people live in them. So the fundamental differences aren't actually noted in the valuation, but the clue is in the size of the land holding and the rateable value. So if you see something that's worth several £100, well, then you know that that's a substantial property. But if it's only worth 7 shillings, well, you get a sense of what that means. So when the valuation was completed, the lessor of the property, the person who was, the occupier of the property was responsible for the payment of the tax that was created. Now, initially, tenants who had a land value that was less than £5 were exempt, and that meant that their landlord had to pay it instead. Now, that liability was a powerful incentive for landlords to get rid of very small tenants. In any way they could, and it did contribute to evictions. However, that was changed by the mid-1830s, and most people were then thereafter responsible for paying their own tax. On the valuation, you also see a plot number which refers to a map, and we're going to look at that in a minute. I also want to make some comments about names on this valuation. So if you've got a list of names in a townland and you see that there's the same name in more than one place in the townland. So say we've got a James O'Shea, and then further down the page, there's James O'Shea. If there's no differentiation on those names, you can take it that it's the same person. Now, even if their plot numbers aren't beside each other, you can take it. And of course, remember that somebody could be renting a field over here in the townland, and then they could be also renting one across a river on the other side of the townland, and it'd still be the same person. So if there's no differentiation, such as junior or senior or another name, well, then you can take it that's the same person. But where this falls down is if you've got two adjacent townlands, and you've got James O'Shea in that second townland, well, then he could well be the same person as in townland A. And you need to have a look at the map, because what you might find is that plot 17 in townland A actually adjoins plot 5 in townland B. And then it would make sense that it probably is the same James O'Shea, and he's renting 2 different plots, and they just happen to be in 2 different townlands, but they're beside each other. He wouldn't care about that necessarily, but you know, it doesn't clarify that. So if it's an adjacent townland and it says the same name, just think about whether it could be the same person Or could it not be the same person? And there won't be any way to tell that from this particular record. So that's one of the difficulties with Griffith's valuation. So you do sometimes see quite poor people in these records as well. They go right down the social strata to people who are renting very tiny plots of land or just a small house, and they go right up the scale to people who own many thousands of acres. So there's a huge variation in what we get in it. And I won't cover it today, but I will mention that these records were not static. So after they did the primary valuation, they continued to go back and periodically revalue the land and update the ownership of the land. And this continued until 1977. So if you're tracing, say, the history of a particular house, it's very useful to be able to start at a point that you know, okay, I know these people lived in this house in 1920, and you're able to go backwards and forwards and see who was in charge of that property, who was paying the rates on it right through the full gamut of time, which is really, really helpful. And people love to see that if you start with Griffith's valuation, you can go forward in time. And so sometimes that helps you identify family members who are still living in a location. So let's pause the screen, the slideshow here now, and we'll go on and we'll do a couple of demonstrations. I might have to unshare and reshare in a second. I know there is a way to do the share and unshare, but it doesn't always work for me, I find. Okay. So I'll come back to in a minute a list of places that we can look at Griffith's valuation. But first, what I want to do is just do a couple of demonstrations for you. And this is the main website that I use all the time, which is askaboutireland.ie. And don't worry about taking that down. I've got a slide that you can have a look at in a minute. So this is an old website and it is updated, but it's a little bit clunky. I'd like to see it in a more modern fashion. And so when you come to this, the first thing you're presented with is to put in a name. So I'm going to put in the name Dunn. Now you'll notice that they do have an include similar names, and you can do that for Soundex purposes. In this case, I'm not going to because I know what I'm looking for. But if you have a name that has variable spellings, and of course we've come across those before, definitely tick that box. And in this case, I'm looking for someone called Christopher Dunn. Now, the next option is to select a county, and watch what the screen does after I select Dublin. You see how it does a little hop there? And it says and or. So if I didn't know where Christopher Dunn lived in Dublin, I could just press search now. But if I want to narrow it down to a particular area, and of course this is a city, county, so there's a lot of places in it, I might decide to add in some extra information. So if I click barony, it'll give me a list of all the baronies that are in Dublin. So I'm going to select Coolock. And then the union, it's going to give me a list of all the poor law unions, which are the same as the registration districts for civil registration. And I'm going to click Balrotherry. And then in parish, these are civil parishes, so they're not the same as the Roman Catholic parish names all the time, although there are ones that are the same. In this case, I'm going to pick a town called Malahide, which is actually the town I come from. And I'm going to search. Now, important point here that when you get these results, they don't have any particular order to them. And it's come up with people called Christopher Dunn who are the occupier. But it's also got some people in the occupier who aren't Christopher Dunn. So probably what that means is when I click on this, I'm going to find that Christopher Dunn was renting to John Byrne and James MacDonald. And I don't know yet if he's the same guy that I'm interested in. So I've prepared this earlier, as you might imagine. So I think the one that I'm interested in is this second guy here. And so the first thing I'm going to do is click on this details magnifying glass. Now this brings up a transcription. And you might say, why would I bother looking at this? Because if you've seen Griffith's valuation before, you'll know that it's actually a printed text. So it's very legible. There are no handwriting reading issues here. But the reason that you want to look at this transcription first is for this point here. It tells me precisely when the printing date is. And when you look at the individual page in isolation, it doesn't have the date of printing on each page. It does have it at the beginning of the section, but you'd have to leaf backwards and forwards till you find that. So you go into this first and go, okay, so Christopher Dunn, this guy here that I'm interested in the Yellow Walls townland of Malahide, is this publication was printed in 1850. So, and they were pretty snappy at getting them out. So this is accurate within about 3 months. Now, it hasn't said what month in 1850, but we can say for sure that within a couple of months of 1850, Christopher Dunn was in this location. So we've got a data point there for him. The rest of it, I actually think they could have done this better because they've used modern terminology like tenant and landlord, but this isn't the terminology that's on Griffith's valuations. I think that could be a little bit confusing for the beginner user. So then we have 3 options for the original page, and it's all just about the size of them. So don't worry too much, and you can zoom them up and down. So when we go in here, we can see that there's a list of this is not the right page. But anyway, I'll just show it to you here anyway. So here's a Christopher Dunn, and this is a category in the town called Mr. Fagan's New Houses. And Mr. Fagan was a property developer. I actually don't know what his first name was. And he was building houses in the 1840s. And here we see that there's a Christopher Dunn, and he is, just zoom it up again so you can see it further. He's at number 6 on the map. And it says that the content of the land is 3 acres, no roods, and 36 perches. And the land is valued at £8 and 18 shillings. And it's just land here. It's actually, maybe it's a house. It's very confusing, this version. And so this is the sort of list that you get when someone is in a town. And so you see, I just want to show you down here, it says the Dublin and Drogheda Railway Company, which means that there's railway in the town, but they're ignoring that because it's not relevant. And then there's also, see, a Coast Guard there and a few other people. So just to note, there are some women. There's a Mrs. Mary Ann Davis, and then there's a Mary Gibbons. I don't know why she doesn't get Mrs. She maybe, and there's a Margaret Hartford. So you can't be certain of a woman's marital status when she has no name, but usually the Mrs. denotes someone who's a widow, is what I find. Let me go back to the other screen for a second. See the one I wanted to. So what we're seeing here is that these come up in a different order every time you search them, which is a little frustrating. That's the same page. So this means that Christopher Dunn is appearing all over the place on this. And it's the same townland. Here's my yellow walls one there. Great. So that was in another part of the village. So perhaps Christopher Dunn has more than one property. And if you see the same name coming up, you need to look at everyone and try and analyze what that means. So what I want to show you here, just because it's relevant to the preparatory work that we're going to go on to in a second, is so this is the Yellow Walls townland. And we see here Christopher Dunn is at number 59 on this. And you see these A, B, and C beside it. So what this means is Christopher Dunn has this 3 acres here, but B and C are also people who are on this plot of land. So there's 3 houses on this plot of land, and one of them is rented by Mrs. Bridget Wogan, and the third one is rented by Catherine Fagan. Now, we don't know what the relationship between these people is, but they are all living in relatively close proximity. Now, it's 3 acres, so it's not enormous. They could all be on separate parts of it. So the other thing that we can do on this website, and this is where it gets a little buggy, is that we can look at a map, but the map does not always load. And this is because it's an old website. The second thing about these maps is that when they came to digitize this content, they found that the maps, because they were working maps and people wrote on them and they folded them and they put them into a bag on the side of a horse and things, that they weren't in great condition. So in some cases, they weren't able to use the original maps. And what they did instead was they took the maps from later revaluations. So I mentioned that they kept updating the valuation. They took the maps from later ones and they put them on. So sometimes when you look at the plot of land and we're looking for a number, it doesn't have the number. And what that means is something has changed over time. But most of the time, it's good enough for us to find what we're looking at. But as you can see, it doesn't want to load. And this is a real flaw with this website because, of course, you want to see the map. You want to be able to pull up a nice image of the area and go, yes, I know exactly where this is. And then, as you can see, you can actually overlay the modern map. So what I want you all to do in your own time is go onto this website and try and load a map. And sometimes you just have to leave it open for ages. I tried it earlier on today and it was working and I thought great, but this has happened to me before when I've tried to show this website. Another option for looking at the maps, if you have them, is Find My Past. If you have a subscription to Find My Past, they do have the maps there as well as the images of the text, so you can look at it there. Now, just to go on to the National Archives for a second, the preparatory work for the National Archive for Griffith's valuation is this section here on the National Archives, Valuation Office Books. And you can see here that these cover an earlier period, and these are the preparatory works. You can also get these on Family Search and on Ancestry. So I'm going to click here and I'm going to search for the same guy again. And this time I'm just going to put in Malahide as the parish. And you can see here the value of this, because here's 5 years earlier, 4 years earlier, sorry, Christopher Dunn in Yellow Walls Townland. And so now I have 2 data points for Christopher Dunn. And when I load it up, we get a little bit more information on the preparatory work. And what I really like about this is you can see here their workings as the surveyor's going around. So here's Christopher Dunn. And instead of it just having the number that we saw and the house and so on the printed valuation, this time we see that it says there's a dwelling, a porch, an office, a shed, a stable and a barn. It says new stone walls, not roof, and so on. And it's got these numbers and letters. Now, if you go on to the homepage of this section of the National Archives, it has some small essays. And I urge you to go back, I'll just show you where they are, and read them. Because you see here in these sections, it actually mentions what those numbers mean. And it's about the quality and what they're made of. So you see here houses and office, and then it's got A, B, C's and D's, and then numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4. So it's worth your time reading that information. So here we go back to it again. I'll just show you one more thing, which I think is interesting. So you see here, we get a little bit more information about Bridget Wogan. So she's crossed out actually, but you see how it says widow there. So now we know that she's a widow, and we might look for other people called Wogan in the townland to see if we can figure out how she is. And it says she's renting her house from Lord Talbot, who was the owner of Malahide Castle. And then we have Catherine Fagan, and it says that she was originally renting from Widow Hogan. So it's a sublet situation. But if you take these numbers, you see how these are lengths, these are in feet and inches, you could actually plot out the size and the layout of this man's property. So you get a much better sense of what it looked like than you did from the other description. The other thing we've got here, and I like to see this, is this 1.62 calculation. And this refers to the calculation that was used to convert the acres from Irish acres into standard acres. So we know that even though these people, this is published in standard acres, these people were still working in Irish acres. So by looking at these 2 different data points, we get some extra information than we would have if we just looked at the published valuation. Let me just swap back to my slides now, and I'll show you where we can see these things. Okay. So I mentioned Ask About Ireland, and feel free to take a screenshot of this if you want. Ask About Ireland is the main place. That is a free website, so I always like to start with the free websites. The maps are a generation later, and they do not always load, as we saw there. The website's a little buggy. The census, it gives census.national archives, but that actually is the link that we just looked at. So you go on to genealogy.nationalarchives.ie to get to it, and then it brings you to that page with the preparatory work. Roots Ireland, which is a subscription site, has transcriptions of Griffith's valuation for various counties, but not the original printed forms. And then both Find My Past and Ancestry have Griffith's valuation on them, and Family Search has the preparatory work. But I looked today and I actually couldn't find the original version of Griffith's valuation, which I do think was there before, but maybe I missed it. But they definitely have the preparatory work anyway. So there's a lot of different places that you can use this, and you might think, oh, what a waste, but actually it's good news for you, because if you can't find someone on the first website or the second website, well, then you can go on. Maybe you've got a subscription for Find My Past or Ancestry, and you can use those to try and find them. Lastly, I want to cover some tips for using these websites. And the first one is something that I say about nearly everything we talk about in this class. And that is that spelling is not codified in this time period. So entries, you get entries for the same places with different spellings. You need to consider that there might be another way to spell someone's name as well as the townland. Shane Wilson's website's really good for that, telling you how it's going to look. And then the National Archives website does not have sound X. So if you're putting in someone's name, it's fine there with a name like Dunn, where you hardly ever see any other spellings of it. But if you've got a surname like O'Rourke, which is one I love to use as an example, it's got about 17 different ways you could spell it, with and without the O, well, then you need to try them all. So that is an example where it's actually better to try searching Griffith's valuation on one of the subscription sites instead of the free sites, because the SoundX will work much better on the commercial sites. You should always check the preparatory work and compare it to the published work for differences. Now, there might not be anything, but just an important example here. I looked for one of my ancestors who lived in Bruff in County Limerick, and he was on the preparatory work in 1848. And when the published work was done a couple of years later, he wasn't there. Now, think about the historical context. That's during the famine, and I reasonably presumed that he had died. And we don't have any death records for the period. And I knew that he was a married man with children who were probably in their 20s. So it wasn't unreasonable to think that he died. But actually he didn't. He emigrated to America and he lived there for the rest of his life. He died when he was 74. So you have to make sure that your reasoning for why someone is there or not there is sound. In this case, he was in the preparatory work because it was done at a time, and then he obviously emigrated before the published valuation. So they did come back and go, okay, is this still correct, before they published it? So just think about things like that. Lastly, I want to recommend a book if you're very interested in this. This is a really excellent publication. Frances McGee used to be the director of the National Archives in Ireland, and she is an authority on this topic. And so she published this book, Archives of the Valuation of Ireland, 1830 to 1865. And it's still available online, and definitely would be able to get it in libraries as well. So I'm going to unshare my screen, and there's time for some questions before we finish up. Any questions? Okay, well, if there's no questions, we can leave it there for today. And as always, you're welcome to send me an email or contact me on Facebook if you have anything particular you wanted to ask about, or if you have any ideas for another session that you'd like to have in these virtual meetings. But otherwise, we'll leave it there for today.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Nancy.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to close the recording now.
Okay, bye-bye.